starting with number 1, Bell P-39 Airacobra, United States, 1941. The P-39 Airacobra entered the war carrying an unusual distinction. Its engine sat behind the pilot, mounted mid-fuselage to accommodate a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. In theory, it was innovative. In practice, that mid-mounted Allison engine created a dangerous center of gravity problem that made the aircraft prone to flat spins, a death sentence from which recovery was nearly impossible. American pilots flying it over the Pacific in 1942 quickly discovered it lacked the high-altitude performance needed to intercept Japanese fighters, struggling badly above 15,000 feet, where its supercharger-less engine simply ran out of breath. The Army Air Forces quietly shifted it away from frontline American units, exporting thousands to the Soviet Union, where it was used at lower altitudes and actually performed adequately. But for the pilots who flew it in the early Pacific campaigns, the P-39 represented a machine that could kill you before the enemy ever had the chance. Number 2, Bell P-63 King Cobra, United States, 1943. Designed as a direct evolution of the P-39, the P-63 King Cobra corrected many of its predecessor's flaws, but arrived too late and too compromised to matter to American forces. The Army Air Forces rejected it for frontline service almost immediately, finding it still insufficiently competitive against late-war German and Japanese fighters. Over 3,000 were built, yet the vast majority went straight to the Soviet Union and Free French forces under Lend-Lease. American pilots who did fly it noted improved handling, but the aircraft carried the institutional stigma of the Airacobra lineage, and no serious effort was made to integrate it into American combat operations. Its most unusual domestic role was as a manned aerial target, armored and used in live-fire training exercises where American gunners shot real ammunition at it. Pilots flying those missions operated under the grim understanding that a miscalculation by any gunner on the ground was entirely fatal. The King Cobra was a better aircraft that still found no real home in American service. Number 3, Curtiss XP-55 Ascender, United States, 1944. The Curtiss XP-55 Ascender looked like it had been designed in reverse, because, structurally, it had been. A push-a-propeller canard configuration placed the engine at the rear and the horizontal stabilizer at the nose, giving it a deeply unconventional silhouette that immediately unsettled the test pilots assigned to evaluate it. Curtiss engineers believed this layout would offer superior pilot visibility and aerodynamic efficiency. What they got instead was an aircraft with poor low-speed handling, dangerous stall characteristics, and a tendency to pitch violently without warning. During testing, one prototype entered an inverted flat spin and could not recover, killing the pilot. The aircraft's controls were described as sluggish and unpredictable, and its overall performance failed to match conventional fighters already in production. By the time 3 prototypes had been built and flown, the Army Air Forces had seen enough. The XP-55 was canceled in 1944, a technical experiment that produced nothing of operational value and cost at least one life in the process. Number 4, Curtiss XP-62, United States, 1943. Curtiss had once been one of America's most respected aircraft manufacturers, but by the middle of the war, the company was struggling to remain relevant against faster-moving competitors. The XP-62 was meant to be their answer, a high-altitude interceptor built around the powerful Wright R-3350 radial engine, designed to catch enemy bombers before they could reach their targets. Development was slow, plagued by engineering delays and constant revisions, and by the time the single prototype finally flew in 1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had already established itself as the definitive American heavy fighter. The Army Air Forces had no appetite for a second program solving the same problem less efficiently. Only one XP-62 was ever completed. It never entered production, never saw combat, and quietly became a symbol of Curtiss's declining position in American military aviation, a program that consumed resources and talent during a period when neither could be wasted. Number 5, Fisher XP-75 Eagle, United States, 1944. The Fisher XP-75 Eagle was born out of institutional ambition and wartime shortcuts, and it failed on both counts. General Motors' Fisher Body division entered the fighter aircraft business with the Eagle, using a novel parts bin approach, incorporating components from existing aircraft, including the tail assembly of a Douglas Dauntless and the landing gear of a Vought Corsair, in an attempt to accelerate production timelines. The concept was administratively attractive. The result was aerodynamically troubled. Test pilots found the aircraft's handling deeply unreliable, with dangerous instability during certain flight regimes and engine cooling problems that raised serious mechanical concerns. 8 prototypes were built before the Army Air Forces concluded the Eagle would never reach the performance standards needed for combat. The program was canceled in late 1944 after consuming millions of dollars and producing an aircraft that, in the words of evaluating pilots, felt unfinished in the air. It was a sobering lesson in what happened when manufacturing logic was applied to aeronautical engineering without sufficient discipline. Number 6. Northrop XP-56 Black Bullet, United States, 1944. Few American experimental aircraft of the war looked as radical, or failed as completely, as the Northrop XP-56 Black Bullet. A tailless flying wing design with a pusher propeller, no vertical tail, and a magnesium alloy structure. The Black Bullet was Jack Northrop's attempt to prove that conventional aircraft configuration was obsolete. The first prototype was destroyed before it ever flew properly, when a tire blowout during a high-speed taxi test caused a catastrophic accident, severely injuring the test pilot. The second prototype managed several flights, but demonstrated dangerously poor directional stability, leaving pilots with little confidence in the aircraft's basic controllability. The lack of a conventional tail meant the aircraft could not recover reliably from certain yaw excursions, a flaw that no amount of refinement resolved. The Army Air Forces terminated the program after evaluating its fundamental aerodynamic limitations. The XP-56 proved that radical design, without the engineering foundation to support it, was simply dangerous, and that wartime was not the moment for unresolved experiments. Number 7. Vultee XP-54 Swiss Goose, United States, 1943. The Vultee XP-54, unofficially called the Swiss Goose by the personnel who worked around it, was another American attempt to build a high-altitude interceptor through unconventional means. A twin-boom pusher design with a pressurized cockpit and an unusual nose-mounted armament arrangement. It represented genuine ambition in its specification, but serious disappointment in execution. Performance during flight testing fell substantially below projections. The aircraft speed, climb rate, and ceiling all came in well under what Vultee had promised the Army Air Forces. The pressurization system was problematic, and the overall airframe proved heavier than designed. 2 prototypes were built and tested, but neither demonstrated the performance necessary to justify further investment. By 1943, with conventional fighters from Lockheed, Republic, and North American already delivering exceptional results, there was no strategic argument for continuing a marginal program. The XP-54 was abandoned, a reminder that ambitious design specifications meant nothing if the engineering could not deliver them. Number 8. McDonnell XP-67 Moonbat, United States, 1944. McDonnell Aircraft was a young company when it proposed the XP-67, and the Moonbat, as it came to be called, reflected both the ambition and the inexperience of its designers. The aircraft featured a highly blended fuselage and engine nacelle design intended to generate additional lift from the body itself, a concept that was aerodynamically ahead of its time. The problem was that the Continental 14-1430 engines it relied upon were chronically unreliable, prone to overheating, and never delivered the power levels the design required. During one test flight, an engine fire caused serious damage to the prototype. The aircraft managed a top speed of only 405 miles per hour, respectable but not competitive with what American industry was already producing in quantity. The Army Air Forces declined further development, and the sole prototype was eventually lost to an engine fire on the ground. The XP-67 left behind an interesting aerodynamic concept and almost no operational legacy whatsoever. Number 9. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, United States, 1940. The P-40 Warhawk occupies a complicated place in American aviation history. It was the primary American fighter available when the United States entered the war, and it served on nearly every front: North Africa, the Pacific, the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease, not because it was exceptional, but because it was available. Against the German Bf-109 and the Japanese Zero, it was demonstrably inferior in climb rate, high-altitude performance, and overall agility. Pilots who flew it against the Zero over the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 learned quickly that engaging in a turning dogfight was a reliable path to being shot down. The tactics that made it survivable, diving attacks, energy conservation, never slow-speed maneuvering, were adaptations to its weaknesses, not expressions of its strengths. Losses were significant in early Pacific engagements, and pilots transferred to newer aircraft with undisguised relief. The P-40 kept American squadrons in the fight during the darkest early period of the war, but it did so by asking pilots to compensate daily for a machine that was already being outclassed. Number 10 Brewster F-2A Buffalo, United States, 1939. If there is a single American fighter that most completely embodies the cost of entering combat with a wrong aircraft, it is the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. Initially procured by the Navy as its first monoplane fighter, the Buffalo was already being overshadowed by the Grumman F-4F Wildcat before the war began. When American and Allied pilots flew it against Japanese forces in 1941 and 1942, the results were catastrophic. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Marine pilots flying Buffaloes against Zero fighters suffered devastating losses. Of the 19 Buffaloes that engaged Japanese aircraft, 13 were shot down and several others severely damaged, with surviving pilots describing their aircraft as utterly inadequate for the mission. The aircraft was slow, poorly armored by that point in the war, and its maneuverability could not match Japanese fighters of the period. The British and Dutch, flying it in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, fared no better. The Buffalo's combat record was not a reflection of pilot failure. It was a reflection of an aircraft that had been left behind by the pace of development. Sent into combat against machines it had no realistic chance of defeating. Number 11 Curtiss SO-3C Seamew, United States, 1942. The Curtiss SO-3C Seamew was designed to replace the reliable Curtiss SOC Seagull as the Navy's primary shipborne observation aircraft, and from the moment it entered service, it became clear that the replacement was far worse than what it replaced. Powered by an unreliable Ranger V770 engine that pilots quickly learned to distrust, the Seamew suffered from chronic mechanical failures, poor handling characteristics, and a tendency toward dangerous instability during low-speed operations. Precisely the conditions under which a shipboard aircraft must perform reliably. Navy pilots flying it from cruisers and battleships found it genuinely hazardous, and the aircraft developed a reputation for accidents that had nothing to do with enemy action. The Navy eventually did something rare and telling. It recalled the Seamew from frontline service and brought back the older Seagull it had been designed to replace. Approximately 795 were built, but the type was withdrawn so quickly that its operational contribution was negligible. The Seamew stands as one of the few cases in American naval aviation where a new aircraft was formally judged inferior to its own predecessor. Number 12 Lockheed XP-49, United States, 1943. The Lockheed XP-49 was conceived as an improved successor to the already successful P-38 Lightning, using the same twin-boom configuration but designed around more powerful engines that promised significantly better performance. In practice, the Continental 11-1430 engines selected for the aircraft proved deeply troublesome, unreliable, difficult to maintain, and unable to deliver the power levels that had been projected during the design phase. The single prototype that flew demonstrated performance that was barely distinguishable from the P-38 already in frontline service, offering no meaningful improvement in speed, altitude, or combat capability. The Army Air Forces saw no justification in producing an aircraft that cost more, used an unproven power plant, and delivered results no better than what production lines were already providing in quantity. Development was quietly terminated, and Lockheed's engineers redirected their efforts toward more productive programs. The XP-49 serves as a clear illustration of how heavily American aircraft development depended on engine reliability. When the power plant failed to deliver, the entire program collapsed with it. Number 13. Ryan FR Fireball, United States, 1945. The Ryan FR Fireball represented one of the most unusual engineering compromises of the entire war. A fighter that combined a conventional piston engine in the nose with a jet engine in the tail, intended to give carrier pilots the reliability of reciprocating power during takeoff and landing alongside the speed of jet propulsion in combat. The concept emerged from genuine uncertainty about whether pure jet aircraft could safely operate from carrier decks. And for a brief moment, it seemed like a reasonable solution to a real operational problem. In practice, the Fireball's performance was mediocre by any standard. The combined power plant arrangement was mechanically complex, maintenance-intensive, and the overall speed it achieved fell below what dedicated jet fighters were already beginning to demonstrate. Only 66 were built, and the type barely reached fleet service before the end of the war rendered the entire compromise obsolete. Pure jet carrier operations proved feasible far sooner than anticipated, and the Fireball's hybrid approach was immediately recognized as an engineering detour rather than a genuine advancement. Pilots who flew it found it interesting, but wholly uninspiring. Number 14. Douglas XTB-2D Sky Pirate, United States, 1945. The Douglas XTB-2D Sky Pirate was designed to fulfill one of the most demanding specifications of the Pacific War, a torpedo bomber capable of operating from the Midway-class supercarriers then under construction, carrying a heavier weapons load over a longer range than any existing naval aircraft. Douglas engineers produced an enormous single-engine aircraft with contra-rotating propellers and an internal weapons bay, and on paper the design addressed the Navy's requirements directly. The problem was timing. By the time the two prototypes flew in 1945, the strategic calculus of the Pacific War had shifted dramatically. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the conflict before the Midway-class carriers entered combat service, and with them went the operational justification for the Skipper-8's existence. The Navy canceled the program immediately, leaving Douglas with two completed prototypes and a design that had no war left to fight. The Sky Pirate was not a failure of engineering. It was a failure of timing, consumed by the very victory it had been built to help achieve. Number 15. Grumman XF-5F Skyrocket, United States, 1940. The Grumman XF-5F Skyrocket predated American entry into the war and represented an early Navy attempt to develop a twin-engine carrier fighter with exceptional climb performance, a genuine tactical priority given how little time shipboard pilots had between spotting an inbound threat and needing to be at altitude to intercept it. The Skyrocket's climb rate during initial testing was genuinely impressive, and for a brief period it appeared to offer something meaningful. But the aircraft was plagued by persistent development problems, engine cooling deficiencies, unreliable landing gear mechanisms, and a short-nosed profile that gave pilots poor forward visibility during carrier approaches, where visual precision was not optional. Grumman refined the design through numerous modifications without fully resolving its fundamental issues, and by the time the Navy needed to commit to a twin-engine carrier fighter, the more promising Grumman XF-7F Tigercat had superseded it entirely. Only one XF-5F prototype was ever built, and it spent its entire life as a test aircraft, never coming close to operational service. Its legacy existed mainly in the comics. The Skyrocket became the inspiration for a fictional superhero aircraft, which was perhaps the most distinguished role it ever played. Number 16. Curtiss XF-14C, United States, 1944. By 1944, Curtiss-Wright's reputation in American military aviation had eroded substantially, and the XF-14C did nothing to restore it. Designed as a high-altitude naval fighter intended to intercept Japanese bombers before they could threaten the fleet, the XF-14C was built around the powerful Lycoming XH-2470 engine, a liquid-cooled power plant that promised exceptional high-altitude performance, but proved chronically unreliable throughout development. When the engine program collapsed entirely, Curtiss substituted a Wright R-3350 radio, but the redesigned aircraft still failed to to deliver competitive performance against what Grumman and Vought were already producing. The Navy evaluated the prototype and found nothing that justified production. It was the latest in a series of Curtiss failures that had accumulated steadily since the early war years, and the company's inability to deliver a successful naval fighter in the critical mid-war period contributed directly to its long-term decline as a military aviation contractor. The XF-14C flew, was found wanting, and was forgotten, a quiet institutional verdict on a manufacturer that had lost its edge. Number 17. Vought F-4U Corsair Early Carrier Variant. United States, 1943. The Vought F-4U Corsair would eventually become one of the most celebrated American fighters of the war, but its introduction to carrier service was so troubled that the Navy initially banned it from carrier decks entirely, a judgment that reflected genuine safety concerns rather than institutional caution. The Corsair's inverted gull wing design, necessitated by its massive propeller clearance requirement, created a long nose that made forward visibility during carrier approaches extremely poor. Its landing characteristics were treacherous. The left wing had a tendency to stall before the right during slow speed approaches, creating sudden, uncontrollable rolls at precisely the worst possible moment. Bouncing on carrier decks was common, and a bounced Corsair frequently went over the side. During the early operational period, accident rates were high enough that the Navy directed Corsairs to land-based Marine squadrons, while the Wildcat and early Hellcat handled carrier duties. British Fleet Air Arm pilots, flying modified Corsairs from smaller carriers, addressed the visibility problem by making curved approaches, a technique that American doctrine eventually adopted as well. The Corsair was ultimately transformed into an exceptional combat aircraft, but only after engineering modifications and tactical adaptations that acknowledged how badly its initial carrier configuration had failed. Number 18. Curtiss C-76 Caravan. United States, 1943. The Curtiss C-76 Caravan was not a fighter, but its failure was consequential enough to warrant examination within any serious accounting of American wartime aviation disappointments. Designed as a wooden cargo transport intended to conserve aluminum for combat aircraft production, the C-76 was built around a material substitution strategy that made administrative sense, but produced aeronautical results that were difficult to defend. The wooden airframe proved heavier than its aluminum equivalent would have been, reducing the payload capacity that justified its existence. Structural concerns arose during testing, and the aircraft's overall performance was judged insufficient for the operational demands of military transport routes. Only 17 were built before the Army Air Forces terminated the program, concluding that the aluminum savings were not worth the capability penalty. The Caravan was a program conceived to solve a resource problem and abandoned when it became clear that the solution created more problems than it resolved, a lesson in the limits of material substitution under the pressures of wartime production. Number 19. Douglas BTD Destroyer, United States, 1944. The Douglas BTD Destroyer was designed to combine the roles of dive bomber and torpedo bomber into a single aircraft, an appealing concept in an era when carrier air-wing composition was constantly being reassessed, and the Navy wanted fewer specialized types and more capable multi-role platforms. The BTD featured an internal weapons bay, a powerful Wright R-3350 engine, and dive brakes designed for precision attack profiles. In testing, however, it proved underpowered for the combined mission requirements, and its performance fell short of what the Navy needed from a successor to the Dauntless and Avenger. By the time serious evaluation was complete, Douglas's own AD Skyraider program, which would go on to become one of the most capable and long-lived attack aircraft in American history, had demonstrated clearly superior potential. The destroyer was canceled after 28 production aircraft, its role absorbed by a successor that made it redundant before it ever reached combat. It was a competent but insufficient aircraft, overtaken by a better answer to the same question. Number 20. Curtiss XP-60, United States, 1941. The Curtiss XP-60 program represents perhaps the most prolonged institutional failure in American wartime fighter development, a development effort that consumed years, produced multiple redesign variants, and ultimately delivered nothing of operational value. Originally conceived as an improvement over the P-40 Warhawk, the XP-60 went through successive configurations powered by different engines, as each promising power plant either underperformed or became unavailable. The Merlin engine variant showed early promise, but was redirected to power the P-40F, stripping the XP-60 of its most viable power plant option. Subsequent variants using American engines failed to achieve the performance the Army Air Forces required. And with Republic's P-47 and North American's P-51 both demonstrating genuinely exceptional results, there was no institutional patience remaining for a Curtiss program that had been underperforming since its inception. Multiple prototypes were built and tested across several years, each one failing to justify continued investment. The XP-60 ultimately became the clearest symbol of Curtiss-Wright's wartime decline, a company that had once led American military aviation, now unable to produce a competitive fighter despite repeated attempts, diminishing resources, and the highest possible operational stakes. If you enjoyed uncovering these forgotten projects, there are plenty more aviation stories waiting to be told. Be sure to subscribe for more videos on failed fighters, secret prototypes, and military aircraft history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.